Previously on agentpalmer.com, after all this time, the right stuff still inspires despite historical inaccuracies. A recap of the 2020 Tour de France, which, had highlights rivaling the 1989 tour. And I'm not sure what I learned from the Friendship series, but I learned something, and eventually I'll figure out what it was. This is the Palmer Files, episode 29 with Sean Haas from Advent of Computing. We discuss the importance of computer history, our device history, and generally geek out about technology. Are you ready? Let's do the show. Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 29th episode is Sean Haas, host of Advent of Computing, a podcast about the shocking, intriguing, and all too often relevant history of computing. A lot of little things we take for granted today have rich stories behind their creation, which is a portion of what Sean and I discuss. It will come as no surprise to those of you that have followed my blog that I myself have an interest in the history of computing, which is why I was excited to find Sean's podcast, quickly became a subscriber, and was honored to have him on this show to share stories of our own computing history, as well as discuss the importance of looking backwards. The technology that we use on a daily basis should not be taken for granted as often as it appears to be. So, conversations about the importance of that history, like what you're about to hear, and podcasts like Advent of Computing that detail and chronicle that history are an important part of understanding where we came from, where we are, and where we might be heading. Before we get into it, remember that if you want to discuss the episode as you listen or after, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, the show at The Palmer Files, and Sean at Advent of Comp. You can also hear Advent of Computing wherever you are listening to this show, or just visit adventofcomputing.com. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com, and don't forget you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com. So without further ado, let's boot up and get this conversation running. Sean, where does the interest in computing come from? Let's just start from the beginning.
Oh, that's not a softball question. So I guess the extreme beginning is just all my life, computers have fascinated me. So when I was growing up, my dad had a degree in CIS that he got in the 80s. So in the house, we didn't really have a new computer, but we had my dad's old AT clone. So a fancier PC, pretty generic. And ever since I was a kid, he'd be doing something on it and he'd let me come sit with him and play with the computer. Just really simple games. I remember we used to play this Donkey Kong clone we had a monochrome screen, so it's just text characters in black and amber. And so ever since then, I've always just been fascinated with what is this box? What can we get out of the box? And it really started kicking into high gear once I got into middle school and started getting educated enough to, read at a higher level, understand logically what's going on. And I started, I know, takes a while sometimes.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's not like a switch, right? And
no.
You're talking about a PC clone, so it's not like we're in the golden age of your computer does everything for you even if you don't know how it works.
Exactly. Just to be clear, I'm relatively young. I'm in my mid-20s now, which feels old to me, but that's not actually very old. So by the time I was using this computer, it was already very obsolete, but my family didn't have all the money in the world to get a very fancy new computer. So it kind of turned into my computer once the family got a nicer one. So I was just kind of let loose on it. And I had all of my dad's old textbooks from when he went to college decades ago at this point. So I taught myself how to use DOS and how to use a PC, taught myself to program a little bit, which I started out with Lisp, which was a horrible decision in retrospect, because if you're familiar, that is a very, very difficult language, and it looks nothing at all like other programming languages.
So did you switch to BASIC, I'm guessing, quickly?
Well, no. So I got into Lisp, and then one of my friends introduced me to C#. And okay, the computers at school, I was able to set up like .NET Studio or whatever and learn C#, which was a little bit easier than Lisp. I didn't have a traditional path into programming. And then just from there, I started learning more and more once I had more access to computers as I was growing up and getting into high school, and eventually got a job as a professional programmer. And since then, I've been embedded in the IT sector. But all along the way, I think mainly because of how I got into computers, I was always interested in older systems because, it's really amazing what we can do nowadays, but really not much of it is new. It's just a lot more stuff. And so looking at computers and programming kind of puts you in this analytical mindset, right? Where you got to think about everything you're doing. So that doesn't really flip off all the time. So it's the kind of thing where you sit down and you're trying to like write an essay for school and you're thinking like, why is this working this way? Why is this text editor 80 columns wide or whatever? And then that takes you down the deep, dark rabbit holes. And eventually you start realizing like, oh, well, there's all these remnants that have been built up over almost 100 years of development.
Yeah, I have a similar story, except that in my case, as a middle-class family, I asked for, because I'm in my mid to late 30s. I don't know where mid ends anymore.
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Right?
So I asked for a Nintendo or an NES, whatever, one of the two, maybe both. And what I got was a PC, which was probably a hand-me-down from something or whatever. So if I wanted to play a game console, I had to go to a friend's house. What I had was a PC when no one was interested in them. So I quickly learned a little bit of BASIC. That was a DOS computer through and through, and it was like, well, it's amazing how far I've come because I have a hard time remembering any of my DOS commands. Which is weird because it was like the way to navigate for the longest time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And, I hold on to PCs, and I was a hybrid marketing IT guy for a very long time. And I was only eligible, like I'm a communications major by trade, like with the degree hanging on my wall. So the marketing fits. The IT part was just because I had taught myself some web code, just, literal HTML, CSS, and a little bit of, maybe some scripts. And other than that, I had been taking apart and rebuilding and or improving and or, well, I have all these parts. Can I put them together? Frankensteining these PCs together. And it was like once you start down that road, and I'm sure there's people listening to this that know someone like, oh, if I have an old PC, like I can just give it to, or I have an old laptop, I can give it. I'm that guy. So like you just end up with things, and then like people find out. So like, look at my worst. I had like 17 towers in my basement in various disrepair, because then you end up with
That's too relatable.
Yeah. I did downgrade, but like I taught myself the IT part of being in that position because of just like knowing things and testing them out. And in that regard, teaching yourself computing and IT is very scientific. You learn a lot from failure. You learn more from failure than anything, because what happens is you hook something up and it works and you go, well, why does that work? When something doesn't work, it's very obvious.
You break something catastrophically and can never replace it.
Yep. So, like, that's where I come in, right? And I think I've stunted my growth as far as PC gaming. Like, there are certain games I have not gotten past. I will always go back and play Quake. Always. That will always be a game for me. Never in the history of anything will I ever not have a computer that can't run Quake, or Duke Nukem 3D, or the original Diablo, or Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness. Those early 90s, those mid 90s games are the pinnacle for me. And I know graphics have gotten better, but like, that's it for me. However, I understand things have moved along, and I got to a point, which is actually how I get to listening to your show. I got to a point in the last 5 to 10 years where I was like, all right, my job is mainly the web. I mean, I'm marketing for the web. I'm not doing any traditional marketing. My side hustle as a blogger, and then, you know, getting into podcasting and social media, is all web-based. So I went down I need to learn about how we got here. And I end up with books like Hackers, and books like Where Wizards Stay Up Late, and all of these origins of the internet type books. And then I start to think about like the personalities, right? So I read the Jobs book, and I read Woz's autobiography. I read that Gates book that was written in the early 90s that is such a, I don't like it's such a revisionist history even at the time it was written.
That's the thing with a lot of computer history books. And I think on my last episode I had a part where I was actually getting kind of mad at the book Fire in the Valley for having inaccuracies in it, but sometimes people just don't show their work in pop history stuff or biographies.
And so all of these things build, and, you know, at the same time, you know, I mean, I always enjoyed Pirates of Silicon Valley, or whatever that little mini series was. And I appreciate it. And as a nerd of the Uber kind, I guess, that's like, I won't touch a Mac because I don't appreciate the aesthetic. I want to know I want to tinker. Like, I want to be able to tinker, and you will never be able to get me in an Apple product. I mean, I've dealt with them. In IT, you kind of have to work both sides of the brain, so to speak. But, so I just kind of got into like, where are we getting, like, where is it all coming from, and how did we get here, and where are we going? Because it's in our, I mean, it's just a general history thing. Like, look back and you can kind of see where we're going. And so like, I end up finding your show, and I'm like, well, this is a guy who gets it. And I'm
thank you.
And well, you're doing the research to a point where like, you're telling me stories I know and adding in details I don't, which is what I so appreciate about it. Cause like, I'm an informed listener, right? I've read some of the books you've read, or they're on my list to read. And it's just like, I'm excited because I like the details. I think like the details, especially in the history of computing, is everything. It's why we end up with people that jumped to 16-bit over 8, or like, you know, the why all of the screens are black and green instead of black and orange, because that was a thing for a little bit there. Could have gone either way. I mean, not could have gone either way, but there's a definitely a intersection where it could have gone the other way. And I'm still like that student that's like, I want more. It's all interesting. I think, you know, I'm running Windows 10 and I skipped Windows 8. But why? Why was that a thing I did? Like, I know what the articles are, but in 10 years, there's going to be a book about the mistake that Windows 8 was, right? Like, we know this is going to be a thing. So I've been kind of following along, but also being behind. Like, I was just like everybody else, almost everybody else in the world. I held on to Windows XP way too long.
Windows XP was the best. It just worked. It did everything you wanted.
It did everything I wanted and then some. Like, I knew how to use it. I got comfortable with it. All of the commands were ingrained in my head. And just like DOS, I am now forgetting all of those commands.
It's the vicious upgrade cycle, right?
It really is. But you, like, so I went first I went internet before I went hardware and computing. And, I definitely appreciate, the Grace Hoppers and like the classic computing and even the pre-electric, pre-digital computing. But like, is it all exciting to you? Like, is this like the world's my oyster? I'm excited to learn about IBM. I'm excited to learn about Intel. Like, bring it all on.
Pretty much. So when I first started the show, I was kind of concerned that there wouldn't be that many topics to do, but there's so much out there. And like I mentioned just very briefly, there's at least 100 years of history that's led us up to modern day, what computers are. And it's the kind of thing where once you start doing the research and start looking into it, it forks so much. And you run into so many things that either reference older technology or older developments, or once you look at enough stuff, you recognize like, oh, well, here's this paper in the 1960s that's talking about ARPANET, but this is actually the same as this 1950s report that some dude wrote at the height of the Cold War. And it's like a tree, right? Where it just branches out so much and you get so far out into the weeds. And all of it's interesting because all of it ends up being connected in really weird ways that you don't expect. And just like you were saying, looking to the past gives us an idea of the future, but it also shows us why we're here and why certain things are the way they are and why we don't have certain things. And you kind of have to take a holistic view of everything to start to understand the bigger picture. And I kind of try to do that with the show. The primary goal is, and I think you're a beautiful case study for this, to get people more interested in the history of computing, because it is a really important topic and it's a really complicated topic that a lot of people, it might not be accessible to them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it falls in line with before I was into computers, and I mean, they were always around, but before that, my first big love was NASA. Like, that was like the thing. And growing up a shuttle child, because that was, and you're part of that too. Like, that was our generation. Shuttle missions, while they were exciting to watch launch, were boring. They were not the flashy Apollo. I mean,
yeah, it's like workhorse. It's a shuttle.
Yeah. So I've read and I've gone down the road of trying to find as many autobiographies as possible. I want the source from the people. Yeah, you have
to get as close to primary as you can.
And there is just something that relates because, and I haven't found the book yet that's like, oh no, computing is there because NASA pushed. There are some little, like there should be like volumes on what NASA did to further computing. And it doesn't seem to exist. Like in Lost Moon, which was renamed Apollo 13 to be in line with the film, they talk about some of the engineers in and around MIT that helped design some of the circuits that they utilized or reutilized or repurposed to help get those 3 astronauts back. But outside of like oh, the astronauts were talking to the engineers because they wanted switches in this position. You don't really learn anything about how much they overlap. And obviously, there's it's nothing but overlap, especially in that era of the 60s where computing is probably growing in leaps and bounds behind the scenes.
Like 60s and 70s were where it seems to explode in just how much advancements are going on, right?
Yeah, and it's look, I still stand in awe when people go like, yeah, like the first computer was 10 grand. What? Wow. Like it's a hobby for me, but you make any of these devices 10 grand and I am out. Like, so the fact that like we talk about like with reverence almost like the homebrew computer club and what those guys did. The Altair was not a cheap hobby project.
No, not at all.
So
that was even like, that's the thing with the Altair specifically is it was so deceptively marketed because the base system is like thousands of dollars in 1970s dollars, and it has 256 bytes of memory.
Yeah. No,
you can't do anything with that.
No, I mean, look, I feel neglectful of all of my machines when I end up with like digital clutter is what I'll call it. Which we're all, I think most people are guilty of this in some things. I think some of the more, I'm going to call myself more of a busybody. I'm more guilty than most, right? In fact, anybody who's listened to this show knows that when I had the designer for my website on and my logo, Ryan called my desktop Icon Salad, and there's a reason for that is because when Ryan and I worked professionally, he would see that I had multiple screens and icons going across them because it was such a like fast-paced, like you have to get stuff done that I'm building like 3 things in Photoshop and then I save them to my desktop and then I move on instead of moving those things around.
And they're just there now.
And that digital clutter just stays. And then I just select it all and move it into a folder called cleanup. And I will get to that later until I don't. And then eventually you just get a new computer. Like, which is horrible. But when we're talking about the Altair being 256 bytes, like I feel like I'm letting someone down from the past who's like, what are you doing? All of that space. You've got 15 copies of that one image because you keep re-downloading it and not moving it. It's like, come on. Like I'm reading these things with like, especially like those days when, in some of the early computing when they're building programs and they only have like 5 bytes to work with, but that's this, that, and the other thing, and they need to save some room for something else, they're like squeezing even like half bit they can, and I'm like, it's space, whatever.
That's okay. We really do. We benefit so much from things that we just don't think about, right? It's kind of like the old aphorism. We very much are standing on the shoulders of giants so that we can like forward an email and have 10 copies of it.
Yeah, we've come a long way. And look, I like to think that being informed means I utilize these things better. And I think to a certain extent it does. Like I can troubleshoot my PC. And that's, I think that's something that everybody should be able to do. And while cars have become more, I'll say electronic and computerized, and unfortunately most cars are now taking the Apple approach of they're all closed systems and they're not open. But like being able to troubleshoot your computer is what changing your oil was in the 80s. Like everybody could do it.
Thing that you should be able to do.
It's a skill you need to learn. And look, I ran IT, and it's one of those scenarios where like you're like, I'm not going to ask you any horror stories, but like
I have so many.
But that's the problem. You shouldn't. It shouldn't be like, why is this computer not working? Because there's 100 Chrome tabs open and 15 pop-ups. Like that's your answer. How can you not see that? And like, so we are standing on the shoulders of geniuses, but we're dripping like our ice cream cone on their face as well while we're up there.
But you have to, I definitely agree with you wholeheartedly. At my job, I program, so I don't have horror stories from that end. I more have horror stories of, why is this code still here? This hasn't been touched in 10 years. This is very unsafe kind of things. But I guess the other perspective is, yeah, we are kind of just, we're frivolous with the amazing technology we have. But in a lot of ways, that's kind of the dream that people have been working towards, right? And I think we see that, like, especially in the 70s and 80s, when people are really starting to come to grips with the idea of, well, we can make a $5 microchip now. We can maybe get a computer that someone could buy, and trying to figure out what a personal computer would look like and how to get computers to the masses. And we've hit that point now. So I feel like a lot of people who were part of that process would be really excited that we can kind of just trash all over this amazing, basically supercomputer technology we have everywhere every day. But it is kind of a shame. There's a little bit of guilt there, I guess.
Well, it goes to the reason that the Macintosh and the early Apples were beige, because Jobs wanted them to be home appliances, and we have them. Like, that's what they are now. They do have stains from being spilled on, like a countertop would. They do have little things, or like, oh, it overheated, or like these are now living, breathing appliances like everything else. This is as ubiquitous now as the refrigerator is. And
and it took so many steps to get there. And that, I don't know, I just think the whole, there's a few really big stories in the history of computers, right? One of them's the internet. That's the big one. But the other one that I really like is the drive towards being able to have an appliance computer that you can spill coffee on. And that it's neat because that goes back so far, and there's been so many little steps, like in the, must have been the early 60s at MIT, when they had like one, maybe two computers. They got a new one, right? And that ended up being the first computer that got a video game written on it, Space War. And one of the people who wrote Space War years later was talking about how when they got that new machine, it was simple enough that one person could operate it. And it was almost like they were able to step into this temple where some religious relic was kept away, because up to that point, you don't touch the computer.
No.
You have technicians that do that. And just even that one step of going from, this is a system that needs a team of people to run it, to, oh, only one person can run this very, very expensive piece of equipment, that we don't have that kind of huge leap today, but all these just steps add up, and eventually we get the appliance computer that we can spill coffee on whenever we want.
Yeah, when you go back and read the internet and computing histories, especially when you're talking about like the PDP ones and like the what most people wouldn't consider digital computers, right? Like, these are massive machines with either punch cards or rolling tape. And it's like, well, that's not digital. It is internally, but like to the user interface, it's not.
It doesn't act digital.
No. And so, you know, my father tells stories about going to computing class and learning punch cards. And it's like, there is an inherently mean streak in me that I agree with Mark Andreessen. And if anybody's not familiar, he's one of the main engines and personalities behind Netscape. But he had said if we had kept the entry level to the internet at technical prowess, the internet would probably be the utopia it was supposed to be. And when we lowered the technical barrier to AOL and just click and you're on, we opened the gates for everyone and utopia disappeared. Now, that's not what he said verbatim, but that's one of the beliefs he has. I have read in my history of the internet that as someone with that technical prowess, I would have loved to have been a part of whatever that utopia was going to be.
Oh, yeah. I think I can sympathize with that one.
It's and I'm not saying like it's just for the elite, but there was a time maybe before AOL or right before AOL when it was Prodigy, and again, you needed commands. Prodigy had some click and point and click stuff, but it was very text-based, and that early text-based stuff, you know, look, people have been spamming email since the moment email existed, right? Like, it's not like it would have been a utopia in the sense that, like, all of the things that we now complain about wouldn't exist. No, those things were born right at the very beginning.
They'd just be less of them. Well, and what's fun about that point is the internet was originally meant for the elites. What's kind of funny is today we think so much like, oh, the internet's a great equalizer, right? Because it connects everyone. If you can get close to a wire, you can connect to the internet. Some cases you don't even need a wire now. But a lot of the original papers on ARPANET, the network that became the internet, talk about how it's for government, research, and military.
Yep.
No one else will ever be able to access this network. If anyone does, it's a federal felony. And then now anyone can get it.
Yeah, and we owe it to a lot of those private contractors at universities and the contractors for the military that were working on it that were like, well, it's not a federal, I'm allowed in. So while I'm in, I'm going to tinker. And that's a good, like, how we got to where we got now is because people didn't go home at 5.
Yeah, people pushed the rules.
And they stayed and they tested things. And look, I don't, like, Moore's Law ended, which was a big deal for those of us that grew up believing that it would always...
Yeah, it always doubles.
Double in speed and, get less and that would always be a thing. Although when you think about it, at a certain point, it can't get any smaller. I mean, not to us as humans and what we can actually perceive. So at some point, yeah, it had to end. I didn't think it would be in my lifetime for some reason. That was one of those big, like, oh, well, that's...
Is it over? Are computers over now?
Like, is that it? Like, so, and but it is one of those things where I guess the reverse of Moore's Law is happening with devices, not necessarily what's inside them. Phones are now getting bigger.
For some reason.
Yeah. Like, look, I have a collection of old smart devices as well. The original.
You mean like this? You mean like this stuff?
I have a whole, yes, yeah. That's an iPhone 3G, I'm guessing?
iPhone 3G.
Okay.
I actually was just pulling a bunch of music off of this last weekend.
So I have the iPhone 3G. I have a bunch of Android devices. I have one of the original Verizon Droids with the flip out keyboard, which is very cool. But my favorite is the original Moto X by Motorola because as a phone, it's slightly smaller than the Apple 3GS you're holding, and it's slightly thinner, but it does everything else I want. And I thought that was the perfect phone. I was like, this is great. And then they came out with the next one, and I was like, this looks big.
Why?
They're like, oh
why
no,
is this here?
Yeah. Well, why is it bigger? Why are we going this other direction? And look, it's not for me. I get that now. Like, it took me years to figure out, like, oh, because my first inclination is to reach for an actual keyboard. I prefer a keyboard and a mouse.
Where you can feel what you're doing.
That's what I want. So my phone's being small is because I'm not doing everything else on it. This is for phone calls.
Maybe emails if they're short.
Yes, maybe. Keeping an eye on Twitter.
Maybe we're just old.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. The more you dig into computing's history, the older you feel, regardless of what your age is, because you pick up, I challenge anybody out there under the age of 40 to pick up a book on even like Jobs or Gates. Like, pick up one of the biographies and read what those guys were working with in the late 60s and early 70s, and then think about the phone in your pocket. And I challenge, like, we've come a long way in a very short period of time, but it kind of ages you out a little bit because you're like, well, they would kill for this kind of power. Like, the computing power is really good. And while, Jobs, may he rest in peace, and Gates is still here, they're still kind of, I still look at those two as like the people of my generation that formed everything. There are other names, but like, those are the rock stars.
Yeah, they're not the flashy ones. That's broadly accurate. Like, I think one of the big things is, and that does come back around to technology like smartphones, is a lot of this is very consumer facing product, right? So they get bigger because, ooh, big phone, very cool, right? And we see the same thing everywhere. Computers get cooler looking, RGB keyboards and everything. But when you're looking at someone like Gates or Jobs, the reason they're so well known is because they're really good at figuring out this is what people want. I think Jobs a little more than Gates.
Sure, absolutely.
Like with the iPhone or with the Macintosh, he was very quick at identifying this is going to be what people are going to want in X years. Whereas Gates is more just, I always think of him as more behind the scenes, but they're the big success stories. Whereas a lot of the people who actually innovated a lot and made the huge leaps are a little less well known because they were, less public facing, less money oriented.
Yeah, that brings me to my favorite discussion point in the history of computing, which is Xerox PARC. Because you can't talk about the history of computing without Xerox PARC. So, first off, in all of your research, I'm sure, for the show specifically, Xerox PARC has been a huge, like, almost data point.
It shows up everywhere.
Okay.
It's bizarre.
But we get either networked computers, we get the mouse, we get the graphical user interface. All of these things come out of Xerox PARC. And one of my favorite games is, imagine if Xerox had figured out what they had.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they knew what they had, but imagine if they had actually gone, like, if the Alto went to market.
If they went the next step.
Yes. It's...
Yeah, there's actually this great book called Fumbling the Future, which is about, it's the perfect title. It encapsulates Xerox, but it's about the development of a lot of the products at Xerox and then how they fail to become actual products. But everything that went on at Xerox PARC, I don't know how any of that happened, because they didn't so they didn't invent the mouse from whole cloth. They didn't invent the graphical user interface or anything, but they took it from research lab into something that they synthesized it all into something that could very well be a really successful product, but never took the next push.
No, so then you end up with, that's why Pirates of Silicon Valley, and while I get the because that's one of the more well-known like fictional dramatizations of the history, and I know in that Jobs talks about like we're pirates, but like the treasure was Xerox PARC for everyone. Microsoft, Apple, it doesn't matter. Xerox PARC was the treasure.
They figured it out over the course of like 5 years and then stopped.
Yeah.
It's wild. One of my favorites is the Xerox Note Taker, which so that's wild technology. It was a portable computer, the first luggable. So it's basically a desktop PC with a screen, and it has a handle on it, so it's portable. But that was created in 1979. It's the first computer ever built that uses an 8086 processor, which is the lineage of what everything uses now.
Yes.
So it has that point going for it. It had a mouse and a detachable keyboard, right? So that's already getting more modern. Had a touchscreen display. It was a CRT, but still a touchscreen. It had a graphical user interface. It had batteries, and it's all portable. And what's wild that I think fully encapsulates why Xerox didn't succeed in the market is they made 10 of these prototypes. And I think the estimated cost was like 50 grand or something. Wildly expensive machines. But you could run a graphical user interface on a battery and take it around with you. And they made those at their think tank in Palo Alto and then flew out to Xerox's main office, which is in like New York. And they're showing it off to the executives as, hey, we have a finished product. We just need to put a little polish on it, get some marketing stuff turned up, work out manufacturing, and we can make a killing because the people at PARC saw the exact future. They like looked in their crystal ball and were able to identify exactly what a computer would be in like 10 years. And then the executives were just like, that seems boring. I don't get it. Why would anyone want this?
Yeah. Well,
and then they just scrapped the project.
There is so much like to the innovators that did it and to the few executives that got it, there were thousands upon thousands of not only executives, but middle managers who didn't get it. I mean, Jobs is in charge of his company. So he gets to say, this is the computer we're going to make as a home appliance. Mm-hmm. But there were tons of engineers and innovators on lower levels across the country and in basements trying to do the same thing, where maybe we would have different names to put up on the computer Mount Rushmore now, but there were middle managers and executives that were like, how much did that cost to make? It's not worth it. Like that will never turn a profit.
Too expensive, too big.
Yeah. Because the more I've read, and I don't know if this is something that you've come across, it feels almost kind of like hive mind-ish. I don't know if there were, I mean, I know everybody was into trade publications, and obviously I've never actually done the research to go back and read them, but it feels like a lot of people had similar ideas in that, especially in the early 70s to early 80s, of what computing could be. Now, not everybody has the technology or the wherewithal or
funding
or the resources, even, because funding's only takes you so far to get there. But like everybody kind of saw where we were going. And what's unique in reading these histories is a lot of these histories were written right close to the border of the history happening. A lot of these books and these, histories are written in the early 90s and mid 90s. an entire history has happened since these, like, I mean, it's one of those things where there are books, and I think Hackers, Heroes of the Digital Revolution, I think is the full title, by Steven Levy. That is written in the mid-90s, 96, 97. Where The Wizards Stay Up Late is written, I actually don't remember when. But the amount of things that I'm aware of that have happened since these books' last page happens is astonishing. Like, we're in and digital archivists is a whole different thing. They're trying to digitize what's on the internet. But how we got here, and like from the mid 90s to here, like that's kind of undocumented to a certain extent. Like, we all understand the .com bubble. We all understand AOL and Netscape, but there's so much more to it.
There's a lot of it that's hidden away, right? And getting back to your hive mind point, there's a couple different theories on overarching how history works. So there's the great man theory, which is like eventually someone shows up and they change everything and that's it. They are the embodiment of change. And then there's the tides and forces, which is, over time, the right parameters happen and everything tips over eventually and you get X, Y, Z. And in my research, it seems like there's kind of both things going on. It's more like you have a cadre of great people that show up that may or may not know each other, that may or may not interact. And you also have just the right situations where they're all able to work on a very similar thing or see the same future. Like, take the mouse, for instance. There's Doug Engelbart, who, along with Bill English. So Engelbart designs and Bill English finishes engineering and building the first computer mouse that's what we would recognize as a mouse. It's a box with a button on it that you move around. At almost the same time in the UK, another engineer designs the first trackball, which is the exact same thing, just flipped upside down.
Yeah.
But because of how that trackball was designed for a radar system, which was a government secret. So there's no way that he could have known about Doug Engelbart or Doug Engelbart could have known about the trackball, but they both developed basically the same thing, just one's flipped over at almost the same time within like 4 or 5 years of each other. And there's so many things where it's very similar technology that happens at wildly different locations with very little connection to each other, but it's the same kind of environment. And so there's some collective unconsciousness there, I think.
Well, I think secondarily or maybe primarily the issue becomes at a certain point, all engineers talk about problems.
Yeah.
And engineers prefer to talk about problems because it's something.
You don't talk about the good stuff.
Well, the good stuff is done. Like there's like, okay, we've got flow through tube 1 and weak flow through tube 2. Why talk about tube 1? We can't make it any better. It's as efficient as it gets. But tube 2, we can maybe plug a leak. We can find a leak. Like there's something to talk about there. So I feel like as these systems mature, all of those engineers, I pick on engineers a little bit, but like it's just scientists in general. Like, let's talk about what's broken. Let's talk about what we need to improve. And so I can easily
it's very
see
human to complain.
Well, that's the other side of it, right? Like it's kind of both things. Like we want to talk about what's broken because it's our job to fix it, but it's also cathartic to talk about what's broken. So this is going to work out really well. It's just kind of, yeah. Look, before we get too far in, has there been any one story or thread or rabbit hole in the episodes you've done where you lost track of time and you just end up like, oh, it's 3 a.m. I have to be at work in a few hours. Like, what was the one that like where time disappeared the most as far as like the research you've been doing?
A lot of these are like that. The biggest one is probably the most obscure one. So one of the things about the show that I try to convey is that the big history is cool, right? Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, cool guys, cool machines. But the most obscure things are oftentimes the most interesting and oftentimes really important. So the one topic that's definitely sent me down a very deep rabbit hole is actually edge-notched cards, which I did a mini episode way back at the very beginning of the podcast about. And what's wild about them is there's almost no scholarly research on them or any kind of academic writing on them since 1958. But they were still in use up to the 80s. So there's this huge chunk of history that is only documented in archives and private collections, which that's the kind of thing where I've spent countless sleepless nights looking into that. And eventually I'm planning on doing a very more in-depth treatment about the topic because it's really wild, since it's essentially a database that's all on paper. It's not a punched card, but it uses similar tooling to a punched card, except no machinery. So you have a stack of paper that, using a needle, you can do filter operations, you can sort things, you can do complex logic operations. It's a database. And there's some decks that you can find if you go to the right private collections that have hyperlinks implemented using just pen and paper and some holes. But there's no research on it. So you really, really have to dig. And I've spent a lot of time digging into that. And like I said, eventually that's going to become a big thing. But right now that's still on like step 3 of 100.
Are you, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but are you at all shocked or surprised by how little information there is? Like you'll be researching any number of things. And I'm a very big believer in like reading begets reading and research begets research. Like you go down, read any biography and the subject you're reading is going to be like, oh no, I totally was influenced by so-and-so. So you go down that road. But like, are you amazed that you're not the only one doing this? You're not the only one like looking at this information. And there are people that are like getting like advanced masters and graduate degrees that are doing similar research. And yet you're finding these threads that are basically there's, and what I'll do is I'll make it an analogy. Like you turn off the road and there's another highway. Great. All this information on Windows 95. And then you get to like certain technologies and you get off the off ramp and it's like dirt road that disappears. And like
that happens very, very often.
But it shouldn't, right? Like this is recent history. We're not talking about the Egyptians. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about
we can still
Greek.
Talk to the people who did this a lot of the times.
Yeah. So is it like, I mean, I've not done the research. I'm just reading some of the books. Like, but is it disheartening? Is it upsetting? Like, do you have an emotion when you like turn down these roads and there's nothing?
It's kind of a mix. So I think it's not disheartening. I think it's more exciting because that means there's work to be done. You get to do something a lot more fun than just reading through some texts. And there's a lot of topics that are very, very well documented, like the development of Unix, the rise of the internet, anything around IBM or kind of Apple. Apple's kind of hit or miss is very well documented. And that's interesting, but it's kind of boring since the story's been told 10 different ways. But a lot of times, like the edge-notch card thing, that's really interesting to me because there's so little information about it that's been collated. Or another great example was when I did an episode on coherent Unix that lasted up till 1995. So very recent history. It ended, the product stopped being sold 25 years ago. Everyone involved is still alive. You could interview them. Very few people have. You could send them an email. Can't find their email addresses. And so there's no one text on coherent Unix. There's a few news articles. There's actually a lot of Usenet posts, which ended up being a very primary source. But besides that, it's looking through old scans of articles, old scans of reference manuals, and Usenet. And I don't know, I think that's a lot more fun than just reading a book that has everything put together for you already, because that means the work's done. Whereas you can find something where you get to do fun work.
No, that's fair. I mean, it's the journey is part of the end.
Yeah.
Like, so I understand that. Is there, I don't know, a topic that is your favorite to go down? I mean, you've covered a lot in the origins of computing, so to speak. So is there is the open source movement something that's, as an example, more intriguing to you? Or, I mean, I'm trying to put you on the spot. Like, is there something that that would be very cool, that's a road I want to go down, versus, look, I'll take it all. Information's information.
Yeah, there's a couple. So I want to cover as much as I can, because I think it's a better use of my time to diversify the content I put up, because a lot of why I'm doing this is so people can learn and people can get interested about different topics. The very early internet is something that I will always love looking into, because I have this big spreadsheet that I use to keep track of my episodes, right? And it's pretty basic. I have a date, the episode number, what the title is, a quick description, then a category, and then just tracking stuff. And one of the categories that I use is spooky. And that's anything that has to do with the US government or military, but becomes big later. And that's the early internet, ARPANET. Or right now I'm working on some material that's very related to early programming languages that were developed only inside the military. And those are the kind of things that I will endlessly want to talk about, because there's so much information that is it's put together. It's like halfway put together, but there's more and more that comes out as things become public domain or FOIA requests are filed. And it always feels kind of subversive, because it's like, ooh, I'm looking through these documents that say declassified on them.
This is probably going to put you on the spot more than any other question. Is there a book in your future?
I'm hoping for that. I've been working on some plans. I'll put it that way. Okay. I don't want to give away anything too big.
No, that's fine. It's because I appreciate the podcast and I understand all of the research that you're doing, but as ubiquitous as podcasting may be right now, you'll reach an entirely broader audience with a book, right? So that's, and you're like, I'm always in favor of doing one thing really good and then finding a way to use it twice. Like, that's always great. So that's why I ask.
Yeah, I'm working on something. It'll come out eventually. Very dependent on when I can get access to archives again. But there is something going on in the future.
Nice.
That's not a podcast.
Nice. Is there a language or software that you want to dive into specifically? Like, you've done some mainly broad things. Operating systems is about as kind of specific as you've gotten, but I don't know. Are you interested in just individual software programs as well? Would that be
kind of? So I try to keep, one of the things I try to do with every episode is it has to be something that's connected to the wider world. And a lot of software is, but it's hard to spin up because part of it's the research, part of it is having some kind of compelling narrative.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just like, in 1978, the silicon production changed by 50%. So there needs to be something more than just data. And I feel like a lot of software, I don't know, there's some software that interests me, but I feel like it doesn't have the same big picture impact a lot of times. One of the things that I have been going really in depth on is my Intel processor series.
Yeah.
And eventually that's going to keep going and just keep going and going. And I feel like that's kind of the same, or it's not software, but it's a similar kind of thing where it's one thing that's in depth over time. But I should look into more software. I think I have some in my tracking sheets. The other thing with doing episodes on specific software is a lot of times you get to the point where it's like there's one developer and one company, and they made a program, which is interesting, but there also just might not be very much material around it.
No, that's fair. I mean, I think back to what I will call a family battle, right? Like anybody with any kind of technical proficiency has been the de facto IT person for their family. And I remember in about 2001 telling my mother, who owns her own business, I said, you have to move over to Word. WordPerfect is going to go away. She's like, no, I'm going to hold on to WordPerfect. And the last version of WordPerfect she had was in somewhere around then, because Corel had finally bought WordPerfect and brought it into the suite. And it was like, at some point, you're going to have to move away from this. And then, you fast forward to like 5 or 6 years ago, it's like, you probably don't need Word anymore. Just move to Google or
just be in the cloud.
Be in the cloud. And it's like, I get it. My mother, the reason she held on to WordPerfect for so long was because she didn't want change. She was like, no,
it works.
It works. I like it. I'm comfortable with it. And not everything's created equal. Like we think, and I say we, but in the general sense, like go from a Google spreadsheet to Excel and not a lot changes, but that's not the way it was for a very long time. So moving from Word to WordPerfect or vice versa, like there were drastic differences at one point. All right. Like,
not so much nowadays.
No, I think everybody's learned that the closer we can make it to uniform, the easier I can get people to switch.
Yeah. Just imitate everything. I guess one program that I do want to eventually cover is VisiCalc, which speaking of spreadsheets, was one of the first big spreadsheet applications that was on a lot of different platforms. And that's kind of has some big implications for like consumer software and kind of turning computers into more business oriented machines. But I don't know. I haven't done the research on that one yet.
We probably made a mistake there. Like we should have kept it as a personal computer. We didn't need to make it all business. That was where
keep business people out of it.
I mean, it would be a very different world if it was like, no,
for sure.
This is, because that's one of those weird things where now we don't think anything of it. Like I have my work computer, I have my home computer, or for a lot of people, it may be one and the same, right? Because you take it back and forth. It's a laptop now. It's portable. But like, not so long ago, if you wanted to access a computer, you had to go to work. In the early 90s, like work, you had a computer at work. Like, yeah, computers were starting to get into the home, but they were more likely to be found in an American office than an American home.
Just because of price.
So, I look, this is a history that keeps going, and I applaud you for doing the work. No, it's something that needs to be done because it's documentation that we will literally lose. The documentation that you're talking about and the research that you're doing, we won't find it buried in 100 years, right? In 200, 300, 1,000 years, all of these computers are going to look relatively the same.
Mm-hmm.
And while there has been a massive change in what has happened in a short period of time, that change is going to be lost to the ages if the research isn't done now.
Document everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
I think that's
why
one of the big points with the show, right?
Yeah, and that's why I appreciate the show. Like it's fantastic.
Oh, thanks. I'm really glad other people like my work.
I don't know why more people aren't interested in the history of the things they use on a daily basis. That's only a fraction of the interest that Sean and I take in the history of computing, but it does make me wonder. Interestingly, it's not just computing as a subject, but reading and research that Sean and I have in common. We're interested in the why and the how. We want to know more than we do. That search for knowledge and that need to know will hopefully never fade. It is that kind of quest that is a lifelong journey of fulfillment with interesting stories, information, and unique perspective that keeps us going. It also keeps us engaged and sustained. Information, by definition, is, quote, what is conveyed or represented by a particular arrangement or sequence of things, unquote. And with that in mind, I want to thank you for transmitting the information of this podcast to yourself. It may have been educational, it may have even been interesting, but above all, I hope that it was entertaining. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 29. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer, the show at The Palmer Files, and Sean at Advent of Comp. You can hear more of him on his show, Advent of Computing, on your podcast app of choice or on his website, adventofcomputing.com. You can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, and all links to all of these things will be available in the show notes. Email can be sent to the show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com if you have any feedback on this or any previous episode, or if there's a topic or guest you'd like me to consider. All right, Sean, do you have one final question for me?
I do. What was your favorite computer? Staying topical.
So I'm torn between two. I had a compact Presario in college that literally lasted 4 years. And then I brought it home after graduation, and it lasted 6 months and died.
Oh,
but
no.
it got me through. But it was like, and it was a big clunky, like compact Presario. Like this isn't streamlined. I don't think it ever left my dorm. So that's one. But I also had a Toshiba Satellite more recently. RIP, because Toshiba's no longer making satellites anymore. And that was the computer that I had when I launched my blog and started kind of getting into indie podcasting. And whereas the Compaq, the battery died and it wouldn't keep a charge, but that was the thing. The Satellite, one of the like defects for Toshiba satellites was that if the battery, it booted off the battery. So if the battery couldn't keep a charge, you couldn't boot it unless there was no battery in the machine. So for the last 3 years that I had that satellite, I didn't have a battery in the laptop because it was completely drained and dead. And the only way to have it boot was to not have a battery in. So it's just like, whatever. But those two, mainly because they were workhorse PCs. I gamed on them. I surfed the internet on them. I wrote on them. I graduated college on one. I launched a blog on another. And when I launched that blog, I did all the programming on that. So, in fact, that computer is also the one where like I learned, like I taught myself or retaught myself HTML from whatever I remembered from my GeoCities days. So like those two PCs or laptops got me to where I am right now. And I think they're also the two laptops, which is one of the reasons, and while the Satellite didn't work this way, why I appreciate laptops in that, like, I've always lived in neighborhoods with old infrastructures. So it's always nice to know that when the power goes out,
yeah, you can keep going.
Or I can at least save things. I don't have to worry about like, it's now the Toshiba towards the end when I didn't have a battery in it. It was like
full systems failure.
Yeah, that was kind of like, ooh. And, the other thing, and I joke about this now, like the Compaq I don't have anymore, but the Satellite I still do. And I could boot it up. I mean, I did reformat the hard drive and all that stuff, and I took it out, and all of that's somewhere on a... Ironically, as we talk about things growing, that hard drive just got copied over to a literal USB thumb drive because those are now bigger than that hard drive was. But the last time I turned it on, it suffered from the same problem it had for the last 6 months, which is how I knew it was on its last legs, which is it got really hot. Like that is a laptop that if I plugged it in right now, 5 minutes from now, I could cook an egg on the keyboard if I wanted to.
That's not a very sustainable work environment, to put it lightly.
No, but those are the two, like, and I think now I'm thinking about my answer in that I think it's what I do with them now. I'm now thinking of them in terms of being tools as opposed to something else, right? As opposed to like, that's a cool hammer versus like, that's a thing I built. Right. And it's like, well, I built that thing, that house with that hammer. So that's why that hammer's meaningful. And so getting a college degree with one laptop or starting my blog and getting into podcasting with one laptop, those are the two that stick out. Also, they're the two I had the longest, the 4 year, and that Toshiba, I believe, lasted 8.5 to 9 years. I'd have to take like a look at some of the other things around. I might be able to like track it down, but I think that computer lasted at least 8 years, which is at least 5 years longer than it should have lasted.
I mean, it does sound like it was breaking a lot, but that's still pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, it still booted up. Like aside from the panic, because that's a panic, right? I mean, anyone who's kind of worked and fiddled with computers, when they won't turn on, that's your worst night.
Sign.
Yeah, because that means you can't fix. Like then we're on hardware, and
it's beyond the pale.
So when I was like, oh, okay, it's a last resort. I'll take the battery out and see if it still boots, and it did. And I was like, all right, I can keep going. And then when it started, radiating heat, it's like, all right, I think it may be time. Over. Yeah. But I that's one that I don't know if I'll be able to get rid of it.
I think that's a great answer. It really is to basically everyone. It's the memories you make with the computer, right? Or with any tool. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter exactly what's inside. There's silicon in there somewhere. There's some gold maybe if you're lucky. But you don't look at that. You look at what you get done with it and what it helps you do. And I think that's the big thing for everyone now is what you can get done with a computer.
Yeah, this is where it all kind of ties back into the history. It's weird to think that that's what we think of computers now, whereas 30 years ago, it was like, what's this device do? Oh, I can connect to the internet. What's the internet?
Yeah.
What happened to, also the language change, right? Like 30 years ago, it was the World Wide Web. It wasn't even the internet. That was a whole different thing.